the bouncer's hand pressed firmly against the weathered oak door of the Veterans Hall, blocking her path. "This is a private event, miss. Members only." Irene Hill stood on the sun-drenched steps, her slight frame dwarfed by the towering security guard, and felt the familiar sting of dismissal. She'd built this community from nothing, spent 3 years knocking on doors and changing lives. But to him, she was just a girl, in her 20s, who didn't belong. Behind that door, 200 motorcycles sat in neat rows, their chrome gleaming in the afternoon light. 200 riders who knew the truth. 200 voices about to prove that sometimes the people who build bridges are the last ones given credit for crossing them. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The morning had started like any other Saturday in the coastal town of Kilraven, with salt air drifting through the narrow streets and the distant rumble of motorcycles echoing off the harbour walls. Irene Hill had woken at 5:30, as she always did, to review the final preparations for the Veterans Remembrance Rally. 3 years of work had led to this moment, 3 years of building something that mattered from absolutely nothing. She stood in her small apartment above the marine supply shop, staring at the corkboard covered in photographs and newspaper clippings. Each image told a story of transformation. Riders who'd found purpose again, veterans who'd discovered that brotherhood didn't end when the uniform came off. At the center of the board was the original photograph, the one that had started everything. Her grandfather, Captain Edmund Hill, standing beside his motorcycle in 1943, his Royal Air Force uniform crisp, his smile confident. He'd died when Irene was 12, but his stories had shaped her understanding of service, sacrifice, and the bonds that formed between those who'd faced darkness together. After his death, she'd discovered boxes of letters in his attic, correspondence with fellow veterans that continued for decades after the war ended. The letters spoke of isolation, of struggling to readjust, of the profound loneliness that came from experiencing things civilians couldn't understand. Those letters had planted a seed that took years to germinate. Irene had studied social work at university, focusing her thesis on veteran reintegration programs. The research was sobering. In small coastal communities like Kilraven, veterans often fell through the cracks, too rural for major support services, too proud to ask for help. The suicide rates were staggering. The isolation was epidemic. After graduation, Irene had returned to Kilraven with a plan that everyone told her was impractical. She wanted to create a motorcycle club specifically for veterans, a chapter that would provide structure, community, and purpose. The idea was met with polite skepticism at best, outright dismissal at worst. She was 23 years old, female, and had never served in the military. The local Veterans Association had listened to her presentation with barely concealed amusement. "We appreciate your enthusiasm, Miss Hill," the association president had said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But veteran support requires understanding that can only come from shared experience. Perhaps you should focus on more appropriate volunteer work." The motorcycle community had been even less welcoming. When Irene approached the established riding clubs in the region, requesting guidance on starting a veterans chapter, she'd been laughed out of more than one clubhouse. "Sweetheart," one grizzled club president had told her, "motorcycle clubs aren't social work projects. They're about brotherhood, about earning respect on the road. You wouldn't understand." But Irene had understood something they didn't. She understood that her grandfather's generation had found healing through connection, that the rhythmic thunder of motorcycles on open roads could be as therapeutic as any counseling session, that sometimes the best way to help someone was simply to ride beside them. She'd started small, placing notices in the local paper and at the community center. The first meeting attracted exactly 3 people, 2 curious veterans in their 70s and 1 active duty soldier home on leave. They'd met in a corner booth at Murphy's Cafe, drinking coffee and sharing awkward conversation while Irene explained her vision. "I know I haven't served," she'd told them, honestly, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "And I know that means I'll never fully understand what you've experienced, but my grandfather taught me that service doesn't end when the mission does. You've given everything to your country. You deserve a community that recognizes that sacrifice." One of the veterans, a soft-spoken man named William Brennan, who'd served in the Falklands, had studied her for a long moment. "Why motorcycles?" he'd asked. Irene had pulled out the photograph of her grandfather. "Because my grandfather said that when everything else felt complicated, riding was simple. Throttle, road, destination. He said it saved him when nothing else could." That first meeting had led to a second, then a third. William had brought his brother. The soldier on leave had invited his father. Within 6 months, they had 15 members. Within a year, they'd registered officially as the Kilraven Veterans Riding Chapter, with Irene listed as founder and coordinator. The growth had been organic, but relentless. Irene had spent her evenings visiting veterans in the community, listening to their stories, understanding their struggles. She'd used her social work training to connect riders with mental health resources, had negotiated group rates for motorcycle insurance, had organized rides that served as both recreation and therapy. She'd also faced constant questioning of her legitimacy. At interclub meetings, other chapters would dismiss her input. When she'd arrange charity rides, some participants would assume she was someone's girlfriend rather than the organizer. Insurance companies had required additional verification that she was actually authorized to represent the chapter. Banks had questioned her authority to manage the chapter's modest funds. The doubt was exhausting, but Irene had learned to channel it into determination. For every person who dismissed her, she found 2 veterans whose lives had been transformed by the chapter. For every condescending comment about her age or gender, she could point to concrete results: reduced isolation, improved mental health outcomes, lives literally saved through intervention and support. Now, 3 years later, the Kilraven Veterans Riding Chapter had grown to include over 200 members. They'd expanded beyond just local veterans to include riders from across the region, creating a network of support that transcended geographic boundaries. They'd raised thousands for veteran causes, had provided emergency assistance to struggling members, had created something genuinely meaningful. Today's Veterans Remembrance Rally was the culmination of all that work. 200 motorcycles would ride through Kilraven in honor of fallen service members, ending at the Veterans Hall for a ceremony and celebration. Irene had spent months coordinating every detail, securing permits, arranging speakers, organizing the route, confirming attendance. She'd even managed to book the Veterans Hall itself, a historic building that had hosted military commemorations for over 70 years. The booking had required persistence. The hall's management committee had initially refused, citing concerns about motorcycle clubs and noise complaints. Irene had presented detailed plans, provided references, and eventually won approval through sheer professional competence. Now, as she locked her apartment and headed toward the Veterans Hall, Irene felt cautiously optimistic. Everything was in place. The riders would be arriving within the hour. The ceremony would honor both past and present service members. It would be perfect. She had no way of knowing that she wouldn't even make it through the front door. The Veterans Hall sat on a slight rise overlooking Kilraven's harbor, its stone facade weathered by decades of coastal winds, but still imposing in its stolid dignity. Irene arrived at 10:30, 90 minutes before the scheduled start of the rally, to conduct a final walkthrough and ensure everything was ready for the ceremony. The building's parking area was already filling with motorcycles, early arrivals from chapters traveling longer distances. Irene recognized several bikes from the Coastal Veterans Riding Alliance, a coalition of chapters she'd helped establish the previous year. The sight made her smile, vindication of the connections she'd worked so hard to build. She climbed the wide stone steps leading to the hall's main entrance, her arms full of folders containing the day's program, speaker notes, and ceremonial details. The heavy oak doors stood partially open, propped by a doorstop to allow the morning breeze to circulate through the building. As Irene reached for the door handle, a massive hand appeared, pressing the door firmly closed. "This is a private event, miss." The voice belonged to a man who seemed specifically designed to block doorways. He stood at least 6'4", with shoulders that filled the entrance and arms crossed over a chest that suggested years of gym membership. His security company polo shirt strained against muscles that appeared to be flexing even at rest. Irene looked up, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "I'm aware," she said politely. "I'm Irene Hill. I organized the event. I need to get inside to finish setup." The bouncer's expression didn't change. "Members only. If you're not on the list, you can't enter." "I'm not on the list," Irene explained patiently. "Because I created the list. I'm the coordinator for the Kill Raven Veterans Riding chapter. This is our event." The man's skepticism was palpable. His eyes traveled from Irene's face down to her casual jeans and chapter t-shirt, then back up with obvious doubt. "You're with the motorcycle club?" "I founded it, actually." Irene shifted her folders to her other arm. "If you check with the hall management, they can confirm. I have the booking confirmation on my phone if you need to see it." "Look, miss," the bouncer said, his tone shifting from professional to patronizing. "I don't know what you're trying to pull, but I've been doing security at Veterans Hall for 5 years. I know the legitimate chapters in this region, and I know who runs them. The motorcycle clubs are run by veterans, by men who've served. They don't have girls in their 20s organizing rallies." The casual dismissal in his voice triggered something familiar in Irene, the same tone she'd heard dozens of times over the past 3 years, the assumption that youth and gender automatically disqualified her from competence or authority. "I understand your confusion," Irene said, keeping her voice level, "but if you'd just call the hall manager, Kenneth Patterson, he can verify my identity. We've been coordinating this event for months." The bouncer pulled out his phone with theatrical slowness, making a show of scrolling through contacts. "Patterson isn't answering, so I'm probably busy with actual event coordination. Tell you what, why don't you wait out here until the real organizers arrive? I'm sure they'll sort this out." I am the real organizer," Irene insisted, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "I have documentation, I have emails, I have everything needed to prove this is my event." "Sure you do?" The bouncer's smirk was infuriating. "Look, I get it. Your boyfriend's probably in the club and you want to feel involved. That's sweet, but this is a veterans' event. It's serious. It's not appropriate for civilians to be playing coordinator." The word playing hit like a slap. 3 years of work, hundreds of hours of coordination, genuine lives, changed and improved, all dismissed as playing pretend. "I need to speak with someone in authority," Irene said firmly. "Right now." "I am the authority at this door," the bouncer replied, his patience clearly exhausted, "and I'm telling you that you need to leave. If you continue causing problems, I'll have to ask you to leave the property entirely." Irene stood on the steps, her mind racing. Inside the hall, her carefully planned ceremony was set to begin in less than 90 minutes. 200 riders would be arriving soon, expecting organization and structure. Speaker notes needed to be distributed. The sound system needed testing. The memorial display required final arrangement. All of it was inaccessible because a security guard had decided she didn't look the part. "This is absurd," Irene said, her voice shaking slightly with frustration. "I have booking confirmation. I have email correspondence with Kenneth Patterson. I have bank records showing payment for hall rental. What exactly would it take to convince you that I'm legitimate?" The bouncer shrugged. "Maybe if the actual chapter leadership shows up, they can vouch for you. Until then, you're not getting in." Behind Irene, the rumble of motorcycles grew louder. She turned to see the first wave of riders pulling into the parking area, dozens of bikes arriving in formation. The sight should have been reassuring, proof of the community she'd built. Instead, it filled her with dread. Her chapter members were arriving for an event that she couldn't access, organized by a coordinator who was being treated like an intruder. The humiliation was complete. William Brennan, the veteran from that first coffee shop meeting 3 years ago, dismounted from his bike and started walking toward the steps. He'd become one of the chapter's most respected members, his quiet dignity earning trust from even the most skeptical veterans. Relief flooded through Irene as William approached. He'd vouch for her. He'd explain the situation. The bouncer would have to listen to a veteran. "Irene," William called out, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Everything ready for the ceremony?" Before Irene could respond, the bouncer stepped forward. "Sir, do you know this young lady?" "Of course," William replied, looking confused. "That's Irene Hill. She founded our chapter, organized this entire rally." The bouncer's expression didn't change. "I'm going to need to see some chapter documentation, sir. Proof of affiliation." William's confusion deepened. "What's going on here?" "Security protocol," the bouncer said smoothly. "We've had issues with people claiming affiliation they don't have. I'm sure you understand, given your service background." The subtle implication was clear. Veterans would understand the need for verification in ways that civilians wouldn't. It was a masterful piece of manipulation, using William's military service to create division rather than unity. William pulled out his chapter membership card, an official credential that Irene herself had designed and issued. The bouncer examined it with exaggerated care, then nodded. "This looks legitimate," he conceded, "but I still need verification from chapter leadership before I can allow entry to unauthorized individuals." "Unauthorized?" William's voice rose in disbelief. "She's not unauthorized. She's the founder." "Sir, I'm going to need you to calm down," the bouncer said, his hand moving to the radio clipped to his belt. "I'm just following protocol. If this young lady is truly affiliated with your chapter, then the leadership can confirm it when they arrive." More motorcycles pulled into the lot, riders dismounting and starting toward the hall. Several recognized Irene and waved. A few noticed the confrontation on the steps and began walking faster, sensing trouble. Irene watched her carefully planned event dissolving into chaos. The ceremony was supposed to start with order and dignity, not with the organizer blocked from her own event. Whispers spread through the arriving riders. Some looked confused, others looked angry. All of them looked to her for explanation. She had none to give except the truth that she'd faced repeatedly over the past 3 years, that no matter how much she accomplished, there would always be people who saw her age and gender first, and her competence not at all. The rumble of motorcycles continued growing louder, wave after wave of riders arriving for the rally. The parking lot was filling rapidly. 200 bikes, 200 veterans, 200 voices about to witness their founder being treated like an intruder at her own event. Irene took a deep breath and made a decision. She'd spent 3 years building this chapter through patience and professionalism. She'd earned respect through action, not confrontation. She wouldn't let a doorway bouncer destroy that reputation now. "William," she said quietly, "go inside and start setting up. I'll sort this out." "Irene, this is ridiculous," William protested. "I know," she replied, "but creating a scene won't help anyone. Just trust me." As William reluctantly headed inside, shooting dark looks at the bouncer, Irene descended the steps and walked toward the parking area. If she couldn't access the hall through the front door, she'd coordinate from outside until someone in actual authority arrived to resolve the situation. Behind her, she heard the bouncer speaking into his radio. "Yeah, we've got a situation at the main entrance. Young female claiming to have organized the event. Possible security issue." Irene closed her eyes briefly, then opened them and walked forward. The real rally was about to begin, and it would start in the parking lot, whether the bouncer liked it or not. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The parking lot had transformed into a sea of chrome and leather, motorcycles arranged in precise rows that spoke to military discipline. Irene moved through the crowd, greeting riders by name, checking that everyone had received the route information and ceremony details. She'd sent everything digitally days ago, but old habits died hard, and she wanted to ensure nothing fell through the cracks. "Irene," A woman in her 50s dismounted from a sleek touring bike, her chapter vest covered in patches commemorating various rides and causes. This was Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Donnelly, retired, one of the chapter's most influential members. "I heard there's trouble at the door." "Minor confusion," Irene said, forcing a smile. "Security protocol. It'll get sorted out." Sarah's sharp eyes missed nothing. "You're the organizer. You should be inside coordinating, not out here managing crowd control." "I know," Irene admitted, "but making a scene won't help the ceremony. Once Kenneth Patterson arrives, everything will be clarified." More riders approached, each with questions about the confrontation they'd witnessed. Irene repeated her explanation, downplaying the situation while internally calculating how long she could maintain organization from the parking lot. The ceremony timeline was tight. Speaker preparation required at least 30 minutes. The sound system needed testing. The memorial wreath placement had to be coordinated with the color guard. All of it was inside, inaccessible. Thomas Riley, a burly veteran who'd served in Bosnia, pushed through the growing crowd. His face was flushed with anger. "That bouncer just told me you're not authorized to be here, that you're some civilian who wandered in off the street." The whispers rippled through the assembled riders. Irene could feel the mood shifting, supportive confusion transforming into indignation. These were people who'd spent 3 years following her leadership, who'd witnessed her dedication firsthand. The suggestion that she was unauthorized was an insult not just to her, but to their judgment. "Everyone, please," Irene raised her voice, projecting the calm authority she'd developed through countless chapter meetings. "I understand you're frustrated, I am too, but we're here to honor fallen veterans, not to create conflict. The ceremony will proceed as planned." "How?" someone called out. "You can't even get inside your own event." It was a fair question, one Irene didn't have a good answer for. She glanced toward the hall's main entrance, where the bouncer still stood, now joined by a second security guard. Both watched the parking lot, with expressions that suggested they viewed the assembled riders as a potential mob rather than honored guests. Her phone buzzed. "Kenneth Patterson." Finally, responding to her increasingly urgent messages. "Irene, I'm running late. Emergency with my daughter's school. Should be there by noon. Is everything all right?" Noon was 30 minutes after the ceremony's scheduled start time. 30 minutes of chaos while 200 veterans waited for resolution. "Kenneth, I need you here now," Irene said firmly. "Your security staff has locked me out. They don't believe I organized the event." Silence on the line, then disbelief. "What? That's absurd. I'll call them immediately." Irene watched as the first security guard's radio crackled. He listened, frowned, then glanced toward the parking lot where Irene stood. His expression suggested Patterson's call had done nothing to convince him. After a brief conversation, he clicked off the radio and remained firmly planted at the entrance. Her phone rang again. Patterson's voice was strained. "Irene, I spoke with the head of security. He says they need in-person verification before allowing access. Apparently, there have been issues with identity fraud at veteran events. It's company policy." "I have documentation," Irene protested. "I explained that. They're insistent." "Irene, I'm so sorry. I'm leaving now. 20 minutes, I promise." 20 minutes felt like an eternity. Around her, the crowd was growing restless. These were veterans, people accustomed to structure and order. The disorganization violated everything the ceremony was supposed to represent. Sarah Donnelly stepped beside Irene, her voice low. "You need to let us handle this. One word from you, and every rider here will make it impossible for those security guards to continue this nonsense." It was tempting, vindication through overwhelming force, but Irene had spent 3 years proving that she belonged through professionalism, not confrontation. Starting her signature event with intimidation would undermine everything she'd built. "No," Irene said firmly. "We wait for Kenneth. We do this right." Sarah studied her for a moment, then nodded with respect. "Your call, Founder." The 20 minutes stretched into 30, then 40. Kenneth Patterson's promised arrival kept getting delayed by traffic, by phone calls, by the universe conspiring against resolution. Meanwhile, the parking lot ceremony that Irene had never planned to host became increasingly inevitable. She'd pulled out her laptop, balancing it on the hood of William Brennan's bike while coordinating last-minute details. The speakers, who were supposed to present inside the hall, had gathered around her, adjusting their notes to accommodate the outdoor venue. Someone had brought a portable speaker system from their bike's saddlebags. Others had improvised a podium from stacked equipment cases. What should have been dignified and formal was becoming scrappy and improvised, held together by determination and the veterans' innate ability to adapt under pressure. Irene felt the weight of disappointment settling over her shoulders. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Irene, a deep voice, cut through her coordination efforts. She looked up to find a man in his 60s, his chapter vest identifying him as president of the Northern Counties Veterans Riding Alliance. She'd met him twice at inter-chapter meetings, where he'd been politely dismissive of her suggestions. "This is unacceptable." "I agree," Irene said. "I'm working on resolution." "No," he said firmly. "You misunderstand. This bouncer blocking you from your own event is unacceptable. The Northern Counties chapter doesn't tolerate disrespect toward organizers, regardless of age or gender. We're prepared to escalate this situation if needed." The offer, while well-intentioned, made Irene uncomfortable. "I appreciate the support, but creating confrontation won't help anyone. Kenneth Patterson will be here soon. We'll resolve this properly." The Alliance president studied her with newfound respect. "You've got more restraint than I would. But the offer stands. If you need backup, you've got 200 riders ready to support you." As he walked away, Irene noticed similar conversations happening throughout the parking lot. Riders from different chapters, many of whom she'd never met, were discussing the situation in tones of increasing indignation. The bouncer's dismissal of her wasn't just insulting to Irene personally. It was insulting to every veteran who'd benefited from her leadership. Thomas Riley approached with a group of younger veterans, all recent conflicts, all dealing with the difficult transition back to civilian life. These were the riders Irene had spent countless hours supporting, connecting them with resources, helping them navigate benefit systems, simply listening when they needed someone who cared. "Irene," Thomas said, "we want you to know something. You've done more for us than any official veterans organization. You've given us community, purpose, a reason to keep going. That bouncer treating you like you don't belong is treating all of us like we don't matter." The words hit Irene harder than she expected. She'd always focused on the work itself, on measurable outcomes and documented successes. She hadn't fully realized how personal the chapter had become to its members, how deeply they'd invested their trust in her leadership. "Thank you," she managed. "That means more than you know." The ceremony's scheduled start time came and went. Inside the Veterans Hall, the carefully arranged memorial display remained unseen. The sound system she'd tested twice sat silent. The color guard waited in confusion, unsure whether to proceed with their planned presentation. Irene made an executive decision. If they couldn't use the hall, they'd create something meaningful in the parking lot. She called the color guard commander and explained the situation. Within minutes, a plan emerged. They'd hold the ceremony outdoors, using the natural amphitheater created by the parking lot's slight slope. Riders began repositioning motorcycles to create a performance space. Someone found an American flag and rigged it to a pole improvised from tent equipment. The memorial wreath, intended for indoor display, was placed on a bike seat at the front of the assembly area. What emerged wasn't what Irene had planned, but it carried a raw authenticity that the formal hall ceremony might have lacked. These veterans, accustomed to making do with available resources, had transformed chaos into something genuine. As preparations continued, Kenneth Patterson's car finally pulled into the lot. He emerged looking flustered and apologetic, immediately seeking out Irene. "I'm so sorry," he began. Irene held up a hand. "Kenneth, I need you to explain to your security staff that I am authorized to be here. Right now." Patterson nodded and headed toward the hall's entrance, Irene following close behind. The confrontation she'd avoided for nearly 2 hours was about to reach its conclusion. Kenneth Patterson's conversation with the security guards was brief but intense. Irene stood several steps back, watching as the hall manager's initial apologetic tone shifted to barely controlled anger. The bouncer who'd blocked her entry maintained his position, his body language suggesting he still believed he'd acted appropriately. "Mr. Patterson," the bouncer was saying as Irene moved closer, "I was following established protocol. We've had issues with unauthorized individuals claiming event affiliation. I was protecting the integrity of the venue." "By blocking the actual event organizer," Patterson's voice carried across the steps. "Miss Hill has been coordinating with me for months. She has documentation, booking confirmations, payment records. What exactly would have convinced you of her legitimacy?" The bouncer glanced toward Irene, his expression shifting uncomfortably. "Sir, with respect, motorcycle club events are typically organized by veteran leadership. I've never seen a situation where a young civilian woman was running the show. It seemed suspicious." There it was, the assumption laid bare. Irene wasn't blocked because of inadequate documentation or security concerns. She was blocked because she didn't match someone's preconceived notion of what a motorcycle club organizer should look like. "That's discrimination," Patterson said flatly. "Based on age and gender, my company will be hearing about this." "I was doing my job," the bouncer protested. "Your job is to verify credentials, not to make assumptions about who belongs based on appearance." Patterson turned to Irene, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Miss Hill, I cannot apologize enough. This is completely unacceptable." Irene looked past Patterson at the bouncer, who was now trying to appear professional despite the dressing down he'd received. She thought about the past 2 hours, the humiliation of being blocked from her own event, the scrambling to maintain organization from a parking lot. But she also thought about the response from her chapter members, the unwavering support, the readiness to defend her legitimacy. The bouncer's dismissal had revealed something important, not weakness, but the strength of the community she'd built. "Kenneth," Irene said calmly, "I appreciate your support, but right now I need access to the hall. We have a ceremony to conduct." Patterson nodded and gestured toward the entrance. The bouncer stepped aside, though his expression suggested he still believed he'd done nothing wrong. As Irene passed him, she paused. For what it's worth," she said quietly. "I understand why you made assumptions. I don't fit the typical profile. But that's exactly why this chapter exists, to prove that service and leadership aren't defined by conventional expectations." Inside the hall, the carefully prepared space waited exactly as she'd left it hours ago. The memorial display, the sound system, the arranged seating, all untouched but now irrelevant. The ceremony had moved outside, had become something different from what she'd planned. Irene quickly gathered the materials she needed: speaker notes, ceremony programs, the memorial register where attendees could sign in honor of fallen service members. Sarah Donnelly and Thomas Riley had followed her inside, along with several other chapter members. "Do you want us to move everything back inside?" Sarah asked. "We can have the space reconfigured in 15 minutes. Irene considered the question. The hall was dignified, formal, exactly what she'd envisioned. But outside, 200 veterans had already created something meaningful from the chaos. They'd adapted, improvised, built community in an unexpected space. "No," she decided. "We finish what we started. The ceremony stays outside." Back in the parking lot, word had spread that Irene had been granted access to the hall. Riders gathered around, asking if they should move inside. She climbed onto the improvised podium, her slight frame elevated just enough to be visible to the assembled crowd. "The ceremony will proceed as planned," she announced, her voice carrying across the lot. "Right here, in this parking lot, with all of you. Because this chapter has never been about fancy venues or formal procedures. It's been about veterans supporting veterans, about community built through shared experience." A cheer rose from the crowd. Irene felt emotion tightening her throat, but pushed through it. "We were blocked from a building today," she continued, "but we weren't blocked from our purpose. That bouncer assumed I didn't belong because I don't fit conventional expectations. But you all know better. You know that leadership isn't about matching someone's preconceptions. It's about showing up, doing the work, earning trust through action." The assembled riders erupted in applause, the sound of 200 people affirming her legitimacy in a way no building access could match. The parking lot ceremony began with the color guards. Presentation. 4 veterans in dress uniform marching in perfect formation despite the informal venue. They carried flags representing different service branches, each movement precise and dignified. As they posted the colors, every rider in the lot came to attention, a sea of leather and denim standing with military bearing. Irene watched from the side, her carefully prepared program forgotten in her hand. What was happening spontaneously in this parking lot carried more genuine emotion than any scripted ceremony could have achieved. The first speaker, a Vietnam veteran named Patrick Hayes, approached the microphone with notes he'd hastily revised for the outdoor setting. "I was supposed to talk about sacrifice and service in the comfort of that hall behind us," Patrick began, his voice rough with age and cigarettes. "But what happened here today showed me something more important than any prepared speech. Our founder, Irene Hill, was blocked from her own event because someone couldn't see past their assumptions." The crowd murmured agreement. Patrick raised his hand for quiet. 3 years ago, Irene came to me asking about starting a veterans riding chapter. I'll be honest, I didn't think she could do it. She was young, she was civilian, she was female, everything conventional wisdom said would make her fail, but she had something more important than conventional credentials. She had her grandfather's letters. Irene felt her breath catch. She'd shared those letters with Patrick during one of their early conversations, but she hadn't realized how much they'd meant to him. "Captain Edmund Hill wrote about the isolation he felt after the war," Patrick continued, "about the difficulty of coming home to people who couldn't understand what he'd experienced. Those letters could have been written yesterday. They could have been written by any of us. Irene understood that. She understood that the pain doesn't end when the uniform comes off." He gestured toward Irene, who remained standing at the side of the improvised stage. "She built this chapter, not because she wanted to play at veterans' affairs, but because she genuinely believed we deserved better. She spent 3 years proving the doubters wrong. And today, when faced with dismissal and disrespect, she didn't demand we fight her battles. She maintained dignity and professionalism, even while being humiliated." The parking lot had gone completely silent, except for the distant sound of harbor waves and seagulls. Patrick's words carried weight that formal speeches rarely achieved. "That's leadership," Patrick said simply. "Not the kind that demands recognition, but the kind that earns it through consistent action. Irene Hill founded this chapter, built this community, and changed lives. Anyone who doubts that can answer to 200 veterans who know better." The applause was thunderous. Irene felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall. She'd spent 3 years being professional, being composed, never letting emotion compromise her credibility. She wouldn't start now, even though Patrick's words had touched something deep. Other speakers followed, each sharing stories of how the chapter had impacted their lives. A young veteran talked about how Irene's intervention had connected him with mental health resources when he was contemplating suicide. A woman described how the riding community had helped her navigate VA bureaucracy to secure benefits she'd been denied for years. Another veteran explained how the simple act of regular group rides had given him purpose after struggling with post-deployment depression. Each testimony was a piece of the larger story Irene had been building. Proof that impact couldn't be measured by conventional credentials or physical appearance. The chapter had succeeded not because of her military service, but because of her unwavering commitment to serving those who had served. As the ceremony continued, Irene noticed movement at the hall's entrance. The bouncer who'd blocked her was standing at the top of the steps, watching the proceedings. His expression was difficult to read, somewhere between chagrin and dawning understanding. Kenneth Patterson stood beside him, arms crossed, ensuring the security staff witnessed exactly what their assumptions had disrupted. It was petty satisfaction, but Irene allowed herself a moment to appreciate the visual of 200 veterans gathering to honor both fallen service members and the woman who'd brought them together. The memorial portion of the ceremony approached. Irene had arranged for a moment of silence, followed by the reading of names of local service members who'd died in recent years. The list included her grandfather, Captain Edmund Hill, whose letters had started everything. As the names were read, the assembled riders stood in absolute silence, their heads bowed in respect. Even the wind seemed to still, the moment heavy with genuine reverence. When her grandfather's name was called, Irene felt 3 years of effort culminating in this single moment. She'd built something meaningful from his legacy, had turned his words about isolation and brotherhood into concrete action that helped living veterans find community. The ceremony concluded with the traditional motorcycle salute, 200 engines starting simultaneously, their combined rumble echoing across Kilraven's harbor like thunder. After the ceremony concluded, riders began mingling, sharing stories, and reconnecting with friends from other chapters. The parking lot transformed from formal assembly space into something resembling a massive family reunion. Irene moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and gratitude from veterans she'd helped over the past 3 years. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Donnelly pulled her aside, her expression serious despite the celebratory atmosphere. "Irene, we need to talk about what happened today. What that bouncer did wasn't just disrespectful to her. It was disrespectful to every veteran who's benefited from your leadership." "It's resolved," Irene said, trying to move past the confrontation. Kenneth Patterson addressed it with his security staff. "That's not enough." Sarah's tone carried command authority that decades of retirement hadn't diminished. "The Northern Counties Alliance leadership has been discussing this. We want to make a statement, something that makes clear how the veteran riding community views your contribution." Before Irene could respond, Thomas Riley approached with several younger veterans. "Irene, same topic. We've been talking, and we think there needs to be formal recognition. You founded this chapter, built it from nothing, and some random bouncer treated you like you didn't belong. That can't stand without response." Irene felt overwhelmed by the support, but uncomfortable with the attention. She'd spent 3 years working quietly, building credibility through action rather than demanding recognition. The idea of making her treatment into a public issue felt contrary to everything she'd tried to achieve. "Everyone, I appreciate the support," she began, "but I don't want this to become about me. Today was supposed to honor fallen veterans, not turn into a referendum on door security." "It's not about door security," William Brennan said, joining the growing circle of chapter members. "It's about the fact that you've spent 3 years proving yourself to people who should have trusted you from the start. That bouncer was just the most visible example of something you've faced constantly." The observation hit close to home. William was right. The bouncer's dismissal was just one instance of a pattern Irene had experienced repeatedly. The insurance companies questioning her authority, the interclub meetings where her suggestions were politely ignored, the banks requiring additional verification of her role. She'd absorbed each slight quietly, believing that professional competence would eventually speak louder than bias, but maybe silence wasn't always the answer. Maybe sometimes standing up for yourself wasn't about ego, but about refusing to accept that some people deserve to be dismissed based on appearance. "What exactly are you proposing?" Irene asked. Sarah pulled out her phone, showing a message thread among chapter presidents from across the region. "The Alliance leadership wants to issue a joint statement recognizing your contribution to veteran support. We're also proposing that you be formally recognized as founder and permanent honorary president of the Kilraven Veterans Riding Chapter." "I'm already the founder," Irene pointed out. "Yes, but there's no formal documentation of that," Thomas explained. "No certificate, no official recognition. Most chapters have their founding documents displayed proudly. You've been so focused on building the chapter that you never took time to document your own role. It was true. Irene had been so concerned with proving legitimacy through action that she'd neglected the symbolic gestures that might have prevented situations like today's confrontation. A formal founding certificate wouldn't have convinced the bouncer of her authority, but it might have made her role more visible to the broader community. And there's something else, William added. We want to address what happened publicly, not to shame the bouncer or the Veterans Hall, but to make clear that the riding community doesn't tolerate discrimination. Irene hesitated. Public confrontation felt wrong, vindictive, contrary to the professional image she'd cultivated. But remaining silent felt wrong too, accepting dismissal as inevitable rather than challenging the assumptions that created it. "Let me think about it," she said finally. The crowd began to disperse for lunch, many riders heading to local restaurants, while others unpacked food from saddlebags for an impromptu parking lot picnic. Irene found a quiet spot near the harbour wall, watching boats bob in the afternoon breeze while processing the morning's events. Her phone buzzed with messages from veterans she'd worked with over the years, word of the confrontation spreading through the broader riding community. Most expressed outrage on her behalf. Some shared similar stories of being dismissed or underestimated. A few offered advice on handling the situation. Kenneth Patterson approached hesitantly, his earlier confidence replaced with obvious discomfort. "Miss Hill, I wanted to apologize again for what happened. The security company has already terminated that bouncer's contract. It won't happen again." Irene looked up at him. "Kenneth, firing him doesn't address the underlying problem. He made assumptions based on what organizers are supposed to look like. That's not a firing issue. It's an education issue." "What would you suggest?" "Training," Irene said, "for all your security staff, about diversity in leadership roles, about not making assumptions based on age or gender. Turn this into a learning opportunity rather than just punishment." Patterson nodded slowly. "That's remarkably generous of you." "It's practical," Irene replied. "Punishment might make me feel better temporarily, but education prevents the next person from experiencing what I did today." As afternoon shadows lengthened across the parking lot, the informal gathering showed no signs of ending. What had started as a formal ceremony had evolved into something more meaningful, a genuine community celebration. Riders from chapters across the region shared stories, compared bikes, and built connections that would strengthen the broader veteran support network. Irene watched the interactions with satisfaction. This was what she'd envisioned when she first started the chapter. Veterans finding community and support in ways that transcended formal programs and official services. The bouncer's obstruction had inadvertently created something more authentic than any carefully planned hall ceremony could have achieved. Sarah Donnelly returned with a group of chapter presidents from the Northern Counties Alliance. Their expressions suggested serious intent. "Irene, we've made a decision. With or without your approval, the Alliance is issuing a statement recognizing your contribution to veteran support in this region." She handed Irene her phone, displaying a draft statement. Irene read it carefully, her throat tightening at the words. The Northern Counties Veterans Riding Alliance formally recognizes Irene Hill as founder of the Kilraven Veterans Riding Chapter and commends her 3 years of exemplary service to the veteran community. Miss Hill has demonstrated that effective leadership is measured not by military service or conventional credentials, but by dedication, competence, and unwavering commitment to supporting those who have served. Her work has transformed lives, prevented tragedies, and built a community that honors the best traditions of veteran brotherhood. Any suggestion that she lacks authority or legitimacy is an insult to the 200 veterans who know better. "It's too much," Irene protested. "I'm not comfortable with this level of praise." "That's exactly why you deserve it," Thomas Riley said. "You've spent 3 years avoiding recognition, focusing on work instead of credit, but sometimes accepting praise isn't about ego. It's about giving other people permission to follow your example." The observation struck Irene as profoundly true. By constantly deflecting recognition, was she inadvertently suggesting that the work didn't deserve celebration, that building veteran support communities was just expected rather than exceptional? There's more, Sarah continued. We want to create a regional network of veteran support coordinators, people like you who organize chapters and build communities. You'd serve as the founding director, providing training and guidance to new chapters. The proposal was simultaneously exciting and terrifying. Irene had focused entirely on the Killraven chapter, pouring all her energy into this one community. Expanding to a regional role would mean replicating that effort dozens of times over, creating a network that could impact thousands of veterans. I don't know if I'm qualified for something that large, Irene admitted. You qualified yourself, William said firmly, by doing the work that everyone said couldn't be done, by proving that determination and dedication matter more than conventional credentials. The group waited for her response. Around them, 200 veterans continued their informal celebration, living proof of what Irene had accomplished. She thought about her grandfather's letters, about the isolation and struggle he'd described. She thought about every veteran she'd helped over the past 3 years, about lives saved and purposes restored. I need conditions, Irene said finally. If I'm going to expand this work, it has to be done right. That means proper training, adequate resources, and clear standards for chapter development. Agreed, Sarah said immediately. We'll establish a formal framework. You design it. We'll provide support. And I want the first training seminar to focus on confronting bias, Irene added. Not just about what I experienced today, but about all the ways people get dismissed or underestimated. If we're building a network, it needs to be inclusive from the ground up. The Alliance presidents exchanged glances, then nodded agreement. Done, Sarah confirmed. When can you start? Before Irene could respond, a commotion near the Veterans Hall entrance drew everyone's attention. The bouncer who'd blocked Irene that morning was descending the steps, no longer in his security uniform. Kenneth Patterson walked beside him, along with the head of the security company. The crowd's conversation died away as the three men approached. Irene tensed, uncertain what was coming. The bouncer stopped several feet away, his earlier confidence completely absent. Miss Hill, he said, his voice carrying despite obvious discomfort. I wanted to apologize directly for how I treated you this morning. I made assumptions based on appearance rather than verification. It was unprofessional and discriminatory. You didn't deserve that treatment. The apology was clearly rehearsed, probably mandated by the security company, but the discomfort in his voice suggested at least some genuine embarrassment. Irene studied him for a moment, seeing not just the man who'd dismissed her, but a representative of every obstacle she'd faced over 3 years. I appreciate the apology, she said finally. I hope you'll learn from this experience. Leadership comes in many forms. Recognizing that is part of growing. The bouncer nodded and retreated with Patterson and his supervisor. As they walked away, spontaneous applause erupted from the assembled riders. The sound built like a wave. 200 veterans affirming Irene's dignity and authority in a way that felt both overwhelming and deeply validating. Sarah leaned close. That's your community standing up for you. Accept it. You've earned it. Irene allowed herself to feel the full weight of the moment. The support, the recognition, the validation she'd been too focused on work to acknowledge she needed. For 3 years, she'd built something meaningful while constantly defending her right to do so. Today, finally, the defense had become unnecessary. The community she'd created had risen to defend her instead. As evening approached, the parking lot gathering showed no signs of breaking up. Someone had brought out portable grills, and the celebration was evolving into an impromptu barbecue. The formal ceremony Irene had planned had transformed into something far more authentic, a genuine community, coming together not because of schedule or protocol, but because they genuinely wanted to be there. Patrick Hayes, the Vietnam veteran who had spoken so powerfully during the ceremony, approached Irene with a weathered leather journal. I want to show you something, he said, opening to pages filled with careful handwriting. After you shared your grandfather's letters with me 3 years ago, I started writing my own, documenting my experiences, my struggles, what this chapter has meant to my recovery. Irene carefully read several entries, each one detailing Patrick's journey from isolation to community. One passage particularly struck her. Today, Irene helped me navigate the VA appeals process. She spent 4 hours on the phone, refusing to accept bureaucratic obstacles. She fights for us with the same intensity we once fought for our country. That means everything. Patrick, Irene managed, emotion thick in her voice. I didn't know you felt this way. Most of us don't say it enough, Patrick replied. We're veterans. We're not great with emotions. But what that bouncer did today, blocking you from your own event, it made us realize we needed to speak up. You've spent 3 years fighting for us, time we fought for you. Around them, other veterans were gathering, drawn by the conversation. William Brennan spoke up. Irene, there's something we need you to understand. When you founded this chapter, we were skeptical. Most of us had been let down by civilian veteran support organizations before. Empty promises, bureaucratic indifference, people who cared more about feeling helpful than actually helping. You were different, Thomas Riley continued. You didn't just talk about supporting veterans. You learned our names, understood our challenges, showed up consistently. You proved yourself through action, not platitudes. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Donnelly stepped forward with a leather-bound document. The Alliance presidents have prepared something. We were going to present it formally inside the hall, but this feels more appropriate. She opened the document, revealing an ornate certificate recognizing Irene as founder and permanent honorary president of the Kilraven Veterans Riding Chapter. But more impressive than the title were the signatures. 200 names. Every veteran who'd attended the rally had signed, each adding brief notes of appreciation. Thank you for seeing us when we felt invisible. You saved my life when I didn't know I needed saving. Leadership isn't about rank, it's about service. You taught me that. Irene read signature after signature, each one representing a relationship she'd built, a life she'd touched, a moment of connection that had mattered. The weight of 3 years' work suddenly felt real in a way it never had before. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Say you'll keep doing what you're doing, William suggested. Say you'll expand this work like the Alliance proposed. Say you'll prove to other communities that veteran support doesn't require military credentials, just genuine dedication. Irene looked across the parking lot at the community she'd built. 200 motorcycles gleaming in the evening light. 200 veterans who'd found brotherhood through her determination. 200 voices that had risen in her defense when she'd been dismissed. I'll do better than that, she said, her voice growing stronger. I'll build a network that ensures no veteran feels as isolated as my grandfather described in his letters. I'll train coordinators who understand that support means action, not empty gestures, and I'll make sure that the next young person who wants to serve veterans isn't blocked by assumptions about who belongs. The assembled riders erupted in cheers and applause. Sarah Donnelly stepped forward and pinned a custom patch to Irene's jacket. Founder, embroidered in gold thread above the Kilraven Veterans Riding Chapter insignia. This isn't just recognition, Sarah explained. It's armor. The next time someone questions your authority, point to this and let 200 veterans explain why they're wrong. As darkness fell, portable lights were set up around the parking lot, transforming the space into something magical. The Veterans Hall's interior lights glowed behind windows that Irene had been blocked from accessing hours earlier, but nobody suggested moving the celebration inside. This parking lot had become sacred ground, the place where a community had stood up for one of their own. Kenneth Patterson approached with his phone, showing Irene a social media post that was rapidly going viral in veteran communities. Someone had filmed the bouncer blocking her from the hall, then the ceremony that followed, then the moment 200 veterans applauded her confrontation with him. The video had been shared thousands of times, with comments overwhelmingly supporting Irene and condemning the discrimination she'd faced. You've become a symbol, Patterson said. Not just locally, but nationally. Other veteran support coordinators are reaching out, asking how you built such a strong community. This could be bigger than any of us imagined. Irene watched the video, seeing herself from an outsider's perspective for the first time. She looked small on the steps, dwarfed by the bouncer's size, but in the footage of the ceremony, standing before 200 veterans, she looked transformed. Not physically larger, but carrying an authority that size couldn't diminish. This was the power of earned respect, of proving yourself through consistent action rather than demanding recognition based on credentials or appearance. 3 weeks after the Veterans Remembrance Rally, Irene stood in the conference room of the Northern Counties Veterans Alliance headquarters, preparing to deliver her first regional training seminar. The room held 30 people, potential chapter coordinators from communities across the region, each hoping to replicate the success of the Kilraven chapter. The diversity of the group surprised her. Young and old, veteran and civilian, male and female, representing communities from fishing villages to manufacturing towns. What united them was a shared belief that veterans deserved better support and a willingness to do the difficult work of building community. Before we begin, Irene said, standing before the assembled group, I want to address something directly. Some of you are veterans with decades of service. Others, like me, are civilians who've never worn a uniform. Some will question whether civilian coordinators have the credibility to organize veteran support. That doubt will be your constant companion. She pulled up the video from the Veterans Hall confrontation, now viewed over 1 million times across social media. This is what bias looks like. A security guard assumed I didn't belong because I didn't match his expectations. But bias isn't just about bouncers at doors. It's in every interaction where someone decides your credibility based on appearance rather than action. The room was silent. Everyone focused intently on her words. The work you're about to undertake will be hard, Irene continued. You'll spend hours coordinating events that seem small but matter deeply to participants. You'll navigate bureaucracies to help veterans access benefits they've earned. You'll answer 3 a.m. phone calls from someone contemplating suicide, and through all of it, some people will question whether you belong in this work. She advanced to the next slide, showing statistics on veteran isolation, suicide rates, and support program failures. These numbers represent the cost of getting it wrong. Every percentage point is someone's father, brother, sister, friend. The stakes are too high for ego or insecurity. If you're going to do this work, you need to be prepared for constant doubt, both external and internal. A hand rose in the back of the room. A young woman, probably mid-20s, with an earnest expression. How do you handle the doubt when people question your legitimacy? Irene smiled. You prove them wrong. Consistently, professionally, without drama. You document everything. You build relationships based on trust earned through action. You focus on outcomes rather than recognition. And when necessary, you let your community speak for you. She displayed images from the parking lot ceremony. 200 veterans standing in support, affirming her legitimacy in ways no credential could match. This is what happens when you do the work right. Your community becomes your validation. The training seminar covered practical topics, coordinating group rides, managing chapter finances, connecting veterans with resources, crisis intervention protocols, building partnerships with local organizations. But underlying every technical discussion was a deeper message about perseverance, about refusing to let doubt, either from others or yourself, prevent you from doing meaningful work. During a break, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Donnelly pulled Irene aside. The Alliance Board met yesterday. We've secured funding for 5 new chapters. In the next year, we want you to oversee their development. 5 chapters is ambitious, Irene said. 6 months ago, 1 chapter seemed ambitious, Sarah countered. You've proven the model works. Now we scale it. Thomas Riley joined them with news from Kilraven. The chapter's membership has grown by 40% since the rally. The publicity from that video brought in veterans we didn't even know existed in the community. It was validation, but also responsibility. More members meant more needs to address, more crises to manage, more lives depending on the support network functioning effectively. Irene felt the weight of it settling on her shoulders, heavier than any climbing pack she'd ever carried. That evening, back in her apartment above the marine supply shop, Irene sat with her grandfather's letters spread across her desk. She reread the passages that had started everything, his descriptions of isolation, his struggles with readjustment, his gratitude for the friendships that had sustained him. "I hope I'm making you proud, Grandad," she said quietly to the photograph on her wall, the young RAF captain standing beside his motorcycle, confident and strong. Her phone buzzed with a message from William Brennan. "Another veteran reached out today, said the viral video convinced him to seek help. You literally saved his life without knowing he existed. That's the impact you're having." Irene closed her eyes, feeling the enormity of it. The bouncer's dismissal had inadvertently created a platform, transforming her local work into something with national visibility. The video's virality meant thousands of people now knew that veteran support could come from unexpected sources, that dedication mattered more than credentials. But with visibility came pressure. Every action now carried weight beyond Kilraven. Every chapter she helped establish would be watched as proof of concept. Every coordinator she trained would represent her approach to veteran support. It was, I think, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. 6 months after the Veterans Hall confrontation, Irene found herself back on those same stone steps, but everything had changed. The Northern Counties Veterans Alliance was hosting a regional leadership conference, and Irene had been invited as keynote speaker. The hall that had once barred her entry now displayed a banner with her name prominently featured. Kenneth Patterson greeted her personally at the entrance, no security guards in sight. "Miss Hill, welcome back. I trust you'll find the accommodations more welcoming than your last visit." Inside, the hall had been transformed into a conference center. Display tables showcased the growth of veteran riding chapters across the region. Charts documented decreasing isolation rates, improved mental health outcomes, and lives saved through intervention. At the center of it all was the Kilraven Veterans Riding Chapter, the proof of concept that had inspired expansion. Sarah Donnelly approached with several people Irene didn't recognize. "Irene, I want you to meet representatives from the National Veterans Support Coalition. They've been following your work closely." The next hour was a blur of introductions and conversations. National organizations wanted to understand how Irene had built such effective grassroots support. Academic researchers wanted to study the chapter's impact on veteran mental health. Media outlets wanted interviews about civilian leadership in veteran affairs. It was overwhelming and slightly surreal. Just 6 months ago, she'd been blocked from this building, dismissed as too young and too civilian to organize veteran support. Now, she was being courted by national organizations as an expert in veteran community building. But the most meaningful moment came when William Brennan took the stage to introduce her keynote speech. His voice carried across the packed hall as he described finding Irene's notice in the local paper 3 years ago, his skepticism about a civilian-led chapter, his decision to give it a chance. "I thought I was humoring a well-meaning kid," William admitted. "Instead, I found someone who understood service better than people who'd spent decades wearing a uniform. Irene taught me that dedication isn't measured by rank or time served. It's measured by showing up day after day, doing the hard work that nobody notices until it creates transformation." He gestured for Irene to join him on stage. As she walked forward, the assembled crowd of over 300 people rose in a standing ovation. Veterans, coordinators, organizational representatives, all acknowledging the journey that had brought her to this moment. Irene stood at the podium, looking out at faces that represented thousands of veterans whose lives had been touched by the expanding network of support chapters. She thought about her grandfather's letters, about the isolation he described, about the community that had sustained him. 3 years ago, she began, her voice steady, I came to this region with an idea that everyone told me was impractical. Start a motorcycle club for veterans, build community through shared rides and mutual support, make a difference in people's lives, not through bureaucracy or programs, but through genuine human connection. She advanced to the first slide, showing that original photograph of her grandfather beside his motorcycle. This is why I started. Captain Edmund Hill, Royal Air Force, my grandfather. He left letters describing the profound loneliness of returning from war to people who couldn't understand what he'd experienced. Those letters were written 70 years ago, but they could have been written yesterday. The next slides showed the growth of the Kilraven chapter, from 3 people in a coffee shop to 200 members, from informal rides to structured support programs, from local initiative to regional network. This is what happens when we stop accepting limitations, when we refuse to believe that support requires specific credentials, when we focus on action rather than arguing about authority. She displayed the video from the Veterans Hall confrontation, now viewed over 5 million times. Some of you have seen this. A bouncer blocked me from my own event because I didn't look like what he thought an organizer should be. That moment of dismissal became a catalyst for something larger. It forced a conversation about who gets to serve veterans, who belongs in leadership roles, what qualifications actually matter. Irene's voice grew stronger. The answer is simple. Anyone willing to do the work belongs. Anyone who shows up consistently, who earns trust through action, who focuses on outcomes rather than credit. Military service is honorable and deserving of profound respect, but supporting veterans doesn't require having served. It requires dedication, competence, and genuine care. The next slides outlined the framework she'd developed for establishing new chapters, the practical steps that transformed enthusiasm into effective support networks. But underlying the technical details was a philosophy about perseverance, about refusing to accept that some people were inherently disqualified from meaningful work. You'll face doubt, Irene told the assembled coordinators. From others and from yourself. You'll wonder if you're qualified, if you belong, if you're making a real difference. In those moments, remember that impact isn't measured by credentials. It's measured by lives changed, by crises averted, by communities built where isolation once existed. She concluded by returning to her grandfather's photograph. Captain Hill wrote that the bonds formed through shared struggle never truly end. He was right, but those bonds can be extended to include people who never wore a uniform, but understand the sacred responsibility of supporting those who did. That's what we're building. A network that honors service by providing genuine, sustainable support to those who've given everything for their country. The standing ovation that followed lasted several minutes, but for Irene, the most meaningful moment came afterward, when a young woman approached hesitantly. I'm starting a chapter in my town, the woman said. I'm 22. I've never served, and I'm terrified that nobody will take me seriously. Watching what you've accomplished gives me hope that maybe I can make it work. Irene smiled and handed her a card. Call me anytime. I'll help you navigate every obstacle, because the work is too important to let doubt, yours or anyone else's, prevent you from doing it. 1 year after the Veterans Hall confrontation, Irene stood in the same parking lot where her ceremony had been forced outdoors, but today she stood there by choice. The Kilraven Veterans Riding chapter was dedicating a memorial garden, transforming the space where community had triumphed over dismissal into something permanent. The garden featured a bronze sculpture of interlinked motorcycle chains, symbolizing the unbreakable bonds of veteran brotherhood. Around the base were plaques honoring local service members, including Captain Edmund Hill. The design had been collectively chosen by chapter members, their input shaping every detail. Governor's representatives attended, along with National Veteran Organization leaders and media outlets, documenting the chapter's remarkable growth. In just 1 year, the model Irene developed had been replicated in 17 communities, supporting over 3,000 veterans across the region. But the most important attendees were the veterans themselves. 200 riders had grown to nearly 400 chapter members. The parking lot overflowed with motorcycles, chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun, representing countless lives transformed through community and support. Sarah Donnelly, now serving as Alliance Executive Director, delivered the dedication speech. This garden represents more than aesthetic improvement. It marks the spot where preconceptions about leadership were shattered, where a community stood up for their founder when she was dismissed, where 200 voices declared that competence and dedication matter more than conventional credentials. Thomas Riley unveiled the garden's centerpiece, a plaque reading, "In honor of Irene Hill, founder who proved that service comes in many forms, dedicated by the veterans who know better." Irene felt tears, threatening, but kept them in check. Professional composure had become second nature during 3 years of proving herself, but William Brennan caught her eye and mouthed, "It's okay." Permission to feel the full weight of the moment. As the ceremony concluded and people began touring the garden, Patrick Hayes approached with his leather journal, now filled with 4 years of entries documenting his recovery journey. "I'm donating this to the chapter archives," he said. "Future members should understand how far we've come, what this community has meant to people who felt lost." "Patrick, are you sure?" Irene asked. The journal contained deeply personal reflections. "I'm sure. My grandfather kept his war experiences secret, couldn't talk about what he'd seen. That silence nearly destroyed him. I'm choosing differently. Let people learn from my struggles and my healing. Let them see that community makes difference between survival and thriving." The afternoon evolved into celebration, complete with group rides through Kilraven's coastal roads. Irene rode in the middle of the pack, no longer leading from the front, but supported by a community that had grown beyond her individual leadership. The network she'd built could now function independently, proof that the model was sustainable. That evening, back in her apartment, Irene reviewed applications from prospective chapter coordinators. The viral video from the veterans' hall confrontation had inspired dozens of people to pursue similar work. Each application represented potential impact, lives that might be transformed through dedicated support. Her phone rang with a video call from one of the new chapters she'd helped establish. The coordinator, a young veteran, wanted advice on handling a crisis situation. Irene walked him through intervention protocols, connected him with appropriate resources, provided the support she'd once desperately needed when starting out. This was the true measure of success, not personal recognition, but a network functioning effectively to support veterans who needed it. The expansion from 1 chapter to 17, from 200 members to 3,000, from local initiative to regional infrastructure. As she prepared for bed, Irene looked at her grandfather's photograph one final time. "I think we did it, Grandad. We built something that matters, something that honors service by actually supporting those who've served." The bouncer who'd blocked her from the Veterans Hall had inadvertently provided a gift. His dismissal had forced a public reckoning with assumptions about leadership, credentials, and who belonged in veteran support roles. The video's virality had created a platform that amplified her work far beyond what she could have achieved through quiet competence alone. Sometimes being underestimated was an advantage. People's low expectations meant that even modest success felt remarkable. And when success proved substantial, the contrast between assumption and reality became impossible to ignore. Irene had spent 3 years proving that dedication mattered more than credentials, that community could be built by anyone willing to do the hard work of sustained support. The Veterans Hall confrontation had simply made that truth impossible to dismiss. Her final thought before sleeping was about the young woman at the conference, the 22-year-old starting her own chapter. Somewhere tonight, she was probably lying awake, nervous about whether she'd be taken seriously, whether she could make a real difference. Irene wished she could tell her that the doubt never completely disappeared, that every new challenge would bring questions about belonging and qualifications, but she could also tell her that proving skeptics wrong became easier with each small victory, that communities built through genuine dedication were unshakable, that sometimes the people least expected to succeed were the ones who transformed entire systems. The bouncer had blocked her from a building. But 200 bikers had revealed she'd founded their chapter, their community, their lifeline, and in doing so, they'd proved that some doors, the ones that truly mattered, couldn't be closed by anyone's assumptions. The memorial garden would stand as permanent reminder. Leadership isn't about matching expectations, it's about exceeding them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.